What if I told you that a single ballot measure could dramatically change California's housing landscape overnight? Well, Proposition 33, the Justice for Renters Act, could do just that. So this video will explain what Prop 33 is, the potential consequences for both renters and landlords if this passes, and why it stands to change rental housing forever. Here's what every Californian needs to know about Prop 33 before you cast your vote. My name is Steve Welty. I'm the CEO of Good Life Property Management. Our mission is to make owning rental property easy. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. Let's go. All right, so what is Proposition 33? So Prop 33 seeks to repeal a bipartisan bill that was passed back in 1995, and it's called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. And what happened back in 1995 was there was a housing crisis, just like today, where prices were very high, inventory was very low. And so these bipartisan legislators, Costa and Hawkins, got together, drafted this bill that said, hey, we're gonna give mom and pop homeowners who choose to rent their home or maybe have a couple, rental houses, peace of mind by knowing that they're not gonna be subject to rent control, which places limits on how much you can raise rent, how you can evict tenants, things like that. And so we want to protect them because we want them to put their properties on the market because we need more inventory. Also, it said, hey, we don't want to discourage developers from building in California because we need more rentals. So we're going to say, hey, any new buildings 15 years or younger, you cannot pass rent control. So that's right. So the headlines you often see about rent control actually doesn't apply to single family homes, condos, or newly built apartment buildings. So basically the one thing standing in the way of your house being subject to rent control is the Costa-Hawkins Act. And that's essentially what Prop 33 is trying to do. It's trying to repeal the Costa-Hawkins Act so that cities and counties can pass any type of rent control they want. Now, there's one other big thing that Costa-Hawkins Rental Act did that almost nobody is talking about or realizes. It prohibits vacancy control, which basically would say if you have vacancy control, that means a state or a city can tell you how much you can rent your property for even when the tenant moves out. So we've all been used to a system where maybe there's rent control on like, hey, how much you can increase the rent on a tenant or whatever. But once a tenant moves out, you're always allowed to like do whatever you want with the property. You could raise the rent or whatever, But when you have vacancy control, that doesn't allow a landlord to raise the rent to market price when there's a vacancy. So repealing Costa-Hawkins, the biggest thing it would actually do is actually permit cities and counties and local governments to pass vacancy control. This would mean when a tenant moves out, you cannot decide what you want to rent your property for. You'd be under the price controls of your local government that says, hey, you can only raise the rent 1% every 3 years, or you have to reduce the rent every 3 years. It's whatever someone will dream up. And it really depends on your local legislature. For example, currently in the city of San Diego, Sean Elo Rivera leads the city council, and his number one issue is rent control. He wants more rent control. And so he's likely to be reelected. And so it really depends on where you live. Those people will now be able to essentially put price controls on your rental property, giving more of your property rights away to local elected officials. All right, so why is Prop 33 bad for renters? While intended to protect renters, repealing Costa-Hawkins would actually have major negative effects in a number of ways. Let me break it down. So number one, there'll be less new development. If local officials are able to pass any type of rent control they want, it's going to discourage developers from coming into markets and building new apartment buildings. So there'll just be less quality apartments, less newer apartments, more rundown buildings. Number two is there'll be less houses and condos for rent. So do you enjoy living in a maybe 3-bedroom, 2-bath house or light condo living? Well, those are owned by everyday people. And if everyday people don't want to be under the thumb of rent control and be told how much they can rent their property for, there's too many onerous laws, they're scared of, doing something wrong and getting sued, then that means there's going to be less single family homes and condos for rent. If rent control then applies to houses and condos, many who just might choose to rent their house out as an extra source of income or hold on to a property, provide a quality house or condo for renters to live in, will not want to take that risk, not want to be under the price controls of local government, and they'll just choose to sell. So there'll be less rental properties. Number 3 is quality housing. So if you cap profits landlords can make at large scale, it's a business. Their incentive is to make a profit. So if they can't make a profit, they're not going to offer their business. They're not going to be in business. And so they're also not going to spend money on fixing up their property if they're not making any money. So generally, the quality of housing will go down. You can see this in other rent-controlled areas where there's just tons of properties that are neglected. There's just maintenance issues because the owners don't want to put any money in because they're not making any money. So number 4 is reduced mobility. So rent control can discourage tenants from moving even when they desire to because they don't want to lose their low rent. This might seem like a weird reason, but let me unpack it for you. So I was speaking to a friend of mine who actually lived in San Francisco for many years. And he said, you know what's funny, Steve? I had a rent controlled apartment and I actually hated it. The reason I hated it was I had this really low rent and I lived with like 3 or 4 other people, but I wanted to move like to the other side of town, or I wanted to do this, but like I kind of felt trapped because I had this low rent and it was kind of like keeping me in my property. So artificially low rents, which by the way, are never means tested, meaning a person making $500,000 a year can be in a rent controlled apartment while someone, making $50,000 a year is trying to find housing. While it might, lower rent, let's say in some cases, the reduced mobility thing is actually a real issue because we only have one life and we want to like go do things we want to do and achieve our dreams and, go after our personal and professional goals. But if we're kind of like locked into an apartment with this artificially low rent, then it blocks us from taking necessary steps in our life. So number 5 is annual rent increases. So working with hundreds of landlords over the years, many used to never raise rent every year. It would be like every few years they'd raise it a little or whatever. But now on rent control buildings, like apartment buildings, they raise rent every year. And the reason they raise rent every year is they have to, or else they'll fall so far behind if you're capped at, 5 or 8%. Or whatever. So it's actually leading to higher rents in most cases because a lot of owners that would have chosen to never raise the rent or not raise it every year, maybe raise it once every 5-6 years, now raise it every year because they're so scared of falling behind to where they'll never be able to catch up. All right, so who's behind Proposition 33? The primary proponent of this ballot measure is Michael Weinstein and the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Very strange, right? Like, why is the AIDS Healthcare Foundation involved in this? And this actually marks their 3rd attempt to repeal Costa-Hawkins. So this was on the ballot, you may have seen it or remember, in 2018 and 2020. And so now it's come back in 2024 again, and the AIDS Foundation has spent hundreds of millions of dollars. And so you might be asking, like, why is the AIDS Foundation trying to get rent control passed? Now it says, quality housing is in line with our mission to help those suffering with HIV and AIDS and their families. Okay, great cause. My problem with that argument is it doesn't hold water for me because you can tie any cause back to housing ultimately. Yes, like you need housing to have a good life. So you could tie, gum disease to housing. Like you can't take care of your gums unless you have quality housing to begin with. Sure, you know what I mean? And so it's a false equivalency. So a lot of people have been questioning their motives and asking, why are they spending millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars of this nonprofit's money that's supposed to be helping people with HIV and AIDS to like try to pass rent control throughout California. So Prop 33 is not a Republican Democrat issue. Like I highlighted, Costa-Hawkins was a bipartisan bill. There's been several notable Democrats, for example, like State Senator Tony Atkins, who is against this bill, Buffy Wicks, Democrat, who's opposing the measure, suggesting that it could halt production of housing statewide and actually make our housing crisis 5-10 times worse. Also, construction unions like the Brotherhood of Carpenters, North California Carpenters Union warned that this proposition might serve as a Trojan horse, which enables cities to impose stringent requirements that might deter new development. The NIMBY problem is like no one wants anything built in their backyard. It's like, well, if there's strict rent control, number 1, it will dissuade builders from building in the first place. But number 2, local cities could make it's so unappealing to want to build anything that like they'll be happy about it because they don't want any new development. You know what I mean? So what's super interesting is there's a proposition, Prop 34, that was actually created in response to Prop 33. Let me explain. So Prop 34 has been funded by entities like the California Apartment Association. And it goes to my earlier point where they're aiming to ensure that nonprofit organizations focus their resources on their primary mission. Proposition 34 suggests that organizations like the AIDS Healthcare Foundation should allocate the majority of their funds to health services, which is their mission, rather than political campaigns unrelated to their core purpose. At the end of the day, I think Proposition 33 comes down to a simple choice. Do we believe that expanding rent control, which is what this bill will do, will actually lead to a genuine benefit for our communities? Or might it actually cause more harm than good? If you believe more rent control is actually good for renters and good for communities, I encourage you to check out the study Stanford did on the effects of rent control. What they ended up finding out was that there was all these overwhelmingly negative unintended side effects of passing rent control. Yeah, sure, some people in existing apartments got lower rent, but it led to all these negative consequences, many that I've highlighted in this video. So I'll put a link to that study in the description below. From my perspective, while the intention of making housing more affordable is admirable, I share that goal. The simplest and best way to do it, in my opinion, is to build more housing and maybe improve some of the existing programs we have, like the Section 8 program. It's essential to consider that property owners, both current and future, lose more property rights as rent control expands. More regulation around how you can operate your rental property reduces liberty, it decreases the value of your property, and it really hurts the people it's designed to protect. What do you think about Prop 33? Let me know in the comments below. I'll respond to every comment, and I really appreciate that you're watching this video.